Late summer afternoon, golden dust curled up from the Cheyenne Fort Laramie Trail. A young woman, hem of her dress torn, clutching a wooden spoon as if it were her lifeline, stopped before the fence of a ranch long unused to visitors. On the porch, a man quietly tapped the ash from his cigarette, his gaze seeming to read the whole of her life. And that evening, a single pot of simmering beans changed both their fates. Part 1. The Girl with the Wooden Spoon on the Trail. The late afternoon sun tilted slowly, laying a pale golden wash over the dusty Cheyenne Fort Laramie road. Red grit clung to every frayed thread at the hem of Clara Wynn's dress, speckling the cracked heels of her boots. She walked not quickly but steadily, as if each step was a small decision, weighed and chosen before it was taken. Over her shoulder hung a faded, dark canvas sack, swollen only at the middle, heavy because of one thing alone, a wooden spoon wrapped in a worn kerchief. She bound it tight, not for fear of it breaking, but of losing it. To others, it might look like a trivial utensil. To Clara, it was the last piece she still held from the days when she could call somewhere home. The late summer prairie wind carried the scent of burned grass from somewhere far off, mingled with the dry tang of earth and stone. Far behind her, the creak of a freight wagon had faded hours ago. Ahead, no living soul, only the wavering scars of old wheel ruts disappearing over a rise. She did not glance sideways or look back. Only when a puff of dust rose from her own footfall did she notice how far she'd gone. Sunlight slid across the loose strands escaping her kerchief, kindling them to a warm brown. On her sunburned face, the lines of fatigue had begun to take root at the corners of her eyes. She did not count the days nor measure the miles left ahead. What she sought was not marked on any map, only a half-formed idea of a hearth, where, when she laid kindling to flame, no one's hand would rush to snuff it out. That thought, however fragile, kept her back straight and her pace even. A flock of migrating birds split the sky, their shadows brushing over the cracked earth like strokes of black ink. Clara paused, bracing her hands on the strap of her sack, drawing a long breath. Sweat slid down the nape of her neck, clinging to the coarse cloth of her collar. She swiped her forehead, her palm calloused, gritty with dust. Far ahead, the trail melted into the bronze of withered grass. It wasn't a view made to be admired, but it was the truth of this land, plain, unyielding, and so quiet you could almost hear your own blood moving. Clara moved on. A dry branch snapped under her boot. She barely noticed, only tightening her grip on the strap when the wind teased at the kerchief-wrapped spoon. A memory flickered of a wooden table, a steaming bowl of soup, and someone's soft laughter from the other side of the fire, then stabbed her in the chest. She shook it away, pushing it back into the locked room where it had lived for so long. The trail lifted to a gentle ridge, where the evening light poured over the mounded earth like thin honey. Clara stopped at the crest, gazing toward a broad, open stretch. No roof lines, no chimney smoke, only empty space. But somewhere beyond there was a ranch. Maybe a few miles, maybe by morning. She did not know whether she'd be welcomed or sent away. Still, her steps leaned forward. In her hand, the wooden spoon lay quiet, a small, steady heartbeat in this vast and lonely world. The western sky deepened toward indigo. She knew she'd have to find a stopping place before night, but that thought did not hurry her. On this silent road she was the only one walking, and the only one who knew what she was searching for. Part 2. The Man Who Kept Silence on the Porch. The last light of summer spread thin as honey across the weathered planks of the porch. Jonas Hale leaned a shoulder against the post, one hand sunk into his pocket, eyes resting on the sweep of grassland trembling in the wind. Out there, the sage leaned and swayed as if whispering something he'd stopped listening for long ago. The shirt on his back was patched at the cuffs, the fresh cloth standing out against the sun-bleached, sweat-worn fabric. At his waist, a tarnished silver watch chain swung gently, a habit's anchor, a memory no one spoke of. On the porch, a long wooden bench still held the faint dip of someone's long-ago seat, though a film of dust lay over it now. A small table sat by the wall, where the coffee pot had long gone cold. He brewed every morning, but for years had poured for no one but himself. The land in front of the ranch stretched far enough for the eye to drift past it without finding an edge. Beyond lay the bluish-green line of mountains, steadfast since before anyone's reckoning. Here, in the midst of all that expanse, Jonas's place was a pinprick, and he, inside it, smaller still. 3 winters had passed since the last cook rode away. He had never looked for another, not because he didn't need one. His meals had withered to little more than salt and smoke, but because letting someone else step into this space felt like opening the door to a draft that might carry in things he wasn't ready to keep. The faint drum of hooves dwindled into nothing, leaving only the whisper through the porch boards and the stall door's tired hinge. Jonas's gaze slid across the yard. The water trough cracked and dry, a few rails sagging in the fence line. There was work enough, but in this country, a man learned to let work wait for him. Sometimes that was the only way to last. Light slanted under the porch roof, touching the tip of one boot, its leather dust-caked but still sound. Those boots had carried him through wet drives and into towns where men sized you up while tipping their hats, and they'd carried him back here to stand silent as he did now, still, enough that a passer-by might think the place abandoned. Inside, the air was a mingling of dry pine and settled dust, the scent of a home that had forgotten how to greet. Windows shut tight, curtains shifted slightly where the wind had its way, but no one straightened them. He kept things as they were, not for perfection's sake, but because change sometimes wore a man down more than leaving it be. Jonas glanced toward the barn. The dapple gray stood quiet, ears twitching toward some faint sound along the trail. He realized he'd heard it too, not hooves, but the rhythm of human steps. Slow, steady, someone coming closer, breaking the long accord between wind and grass. He didn't step down, only straightened, hand leaving his pocket, letting the last of the daylight show the lines at the corners of his eyes. Inside, there was no clear rise of caution or welcome, just the habit of listening before allowing anything to come nearer. The wind shifted, carrying with it the dry tang of road dust and something else. Faint, like the ghost of a fire recently lit, far off. Jonas stayed where he was, gaze fixed on the trail. In another few seconds he'd see more clearly, for now he let the silence hold, an old companion, and perhaps the only thing he trusted, without question. Part 3. A quiet prairie evening. The sun drifted slowly toward the horizon, its light spilling evenly over grasslands burned gold by summer's long heat. The air at day's end seemed to have weight, heavy enough that even the gentlest breeze could stir the whole sky, carrying the scent of sage from a far ridge and the dry tang of earth long without rain. At the far end of the yard, a wagon load of hay was nearly emptied. 2 ranch hands bent to lift the squared bales, passing them back and forth without many words, just a nod or a flick of the chin. Sweat on their brows mingled with the dust of the hay, making a scent all its own, the smell of late-season work. The porch stretched wide before the house, its boards darkened by sun and years. On a rough-hewn table, a tin coffee pot still gave off a faint heat, the air above it rich with the bite of beans roasted, long and thinned with well water that always carried a whisper of iron. Beside it lay a worn deck of cards, the top one curled slightly at the corner from too many shuffles. No one was in a hurry to leave the table. The others sat scattered about, each in their own way, soaking in the stillness that comes only after a day's labor. Voices rose and fell slowly, as if no one wanted to break the breathing rhythm of the afternoon. A short remark, a low chuckle, then silence again, not uncomfortable, just settled. Beyond, the fence lines ran uneven as a pencil line across the land, curving with the lay of the ground. The fields on the far side shone with the slant of the sun, dotted here and there by the dark humps of grazing cattle, heads down, tails flicking at flies. Above, a hawk circled its shadow, flashing across the hard-packed earth near the barn before it vanished into the empty behind the hills. From the barn door came the scrape of a hoof against dry dirt. The bay horse poked its head out, ears swiveling toward the sound, then withdrew again, used to such noises, knowing none of them meant more than another mouthful of hay. The air here was like the bottom of a deep well of quiet. Anyone stepping into it would feel themselves slow down, in thought and in motion. Even for those who had lived here long, like Jonas, there was always a moment when the day was closing but night hadn't yet opened, when the light shifted color, the wind changed scent, and every sound seemed to space itself farther apart. The sun's shadow stretched across the ground, reaching the first step of the porch. Jonas stood there, eyes moving over the familiar scene. He wasn't looking for anything. It was simply habit, keeping sight of what was his, though it had no mind to leave. Somewhere on the trail, just at the edge of sight, a wisp of dust rose and vanished in the wind. No one noticed. The afternoon moved on as it had 100 times before, slow with little change, as if tomorrow would arrive on the same clock it always had. Here loneliness wasn't a thing to chafe at. It was more like a heavy quilt you'd grown used to, weighty, warm, and sheltering, but it was also the kind of quiet that made any strange sight or sound stand out sharper than it would anywhere else. And this afternoon, that quiet was about to be broken. Part 4. The Girl in the Golden Dust. From the far eastern fence line, where the dirt road led straight to the ranch gate, a figure emerged against the backlight of the setting sun. The slanting light turned everything behind her into a bright halo, leaving only the clear outline of narrow shoulders and the gleam of a black iron pot swinging at its handle. The day's last wind swept across the grass, lifting a pale ribbon of road dust around the frayed hem of her dress. The fine particles clung to her worn boots, adding another coat of age to steps that were already slow. Clara Wynne didn't glance to either side, didn't pause. She walked as though the space between where she stood and that porch ahead had been marked out for her long ago. As she neared the fence, the scatter of talk among the hands faltered, then stopped entirely. One man straightened from the haystack to watch. Another set down his coffee, hand braced on the rim of the cup as if to shield his eyes from the glare behind her. The whole porch sank into a kind of stillness, usually reserved for moments when no one yet knows whether to welcome or to withhold. Clara stopped a few paces from the steps and set the pot down with both hands, careful as if it held something fragile. Her fingers let go of the handle but hovered close, the instinct of someone not ready to put distance between herself and the only thing she carried. Jonas Hale, still leaning on the porch post, straightened a touch. His eyes narrowed, not against the light, but to see her more clearly, the posture of a man unaccustomed to letting strangers cross into his days. The slanting light caught the sunburn on her cheeks, the wind-tangled edges of her hair, the shawl worn to the point that its fringe hung like spider silk. A sharp wind rattled the fence rails, carrying the mingled scents of earth and dried grass across the space between them. Clara didn't move. Neither did Jonas. The air between them seemed to thicken, holding only the slow drift of dust motes in the last of the evening glow. To an outsider, she might have been just another tired traveler from the long road, but here, in the eyes of men accustomed to solitude, her arrival was a question. Was this the moment to let another human touch the rhythm they had kept so carefully undisturbed? A chair creaked faintly as someone shifted an elbow on the table, then went still again. No one spoke. Clara stood there, her gaze neither pleading nor guarded, more like someone who had come too far to turn back and knew that all that remained was to take one more step forward, or turn into the gold-lit dust waiting to swallow her. The wind eased, the dust settled. The last sunbeam slid off the toe of her boot, leaving her in the porch's shadow. And in that brief heartbeat, it felt as though the whole ranch was holding its breath, waiting to see who would be the first to break the quiet. Part 5. A one-sentence introduction. Clara stood there, her fingers loosely entwined, as if holding herself in place against the weight of the silence. The last of the daylight had drained from the pasture, leaving only a thin red blade of light along the horizon. No one spoke. The wind slipped under the porch roof, carrying the smell of dry hay and some far-off cook fire. She lifted her gaze, steady, neither evasive nor searching. Her voice came out dry as gravel, but level and sure. "I don't talk much, but I can cook." The words dropped into the space between them like a pebble into a deep well, brief, clean, and gone, leaving the quiet even thicker than before. No explanation, no story, no reason given, just a fact, set down in the open for anyone to take or leave. A faint breeze tugged a few strands of brown hair from her faded shawl. The fringe stirred softly, carrying the weary look of long miles traveled. She didn't smile. She didn't show a trace of expectation. She simply stood there as though that sentence was all the stake she had left to lay on the table. On the porch, Jonas kept his shoulder to the post, his hand moving slowly over the sun-hardened grain of the wood. He didn't answer, his eyes traced from the iron pot at her feet, up the tight knot of her hands, to a face half in the last light, half in shadow. Somewhere in his chest, something unnamed stirred, a mix of curiosity and a dim memory of a day when he himself had stood at the edge of being turned away, or taken in. A board underfoot creaked as he shifted his weight, but the silence held. It stretched long enough for the ranch hands behind him to glance at each other, as if waiting for a sign. In the barn, a horse snorted, breaking the stillness for a heartbeat before it closed over again. Clara offered nothing more. Out here, one sentence could be enough. The rest would be proved in action, or not at all. And in that moment, under the shadow of the old porch, those few words reached farther than any plea or defense could have. Jonas tipped his head slightly, but made no decision yet. The space between them remained intact, but somewhere in that span, between drifting motes of golden dust and the day's last wind, a narrow gap had just opened. Part 6, testing the fire. Jonas stayed at the porch's edge, one hand hooked on the weather-darkened post. The evening wind from the fields brought the scent of dry hay and sage-dusted earth, running through his hair, but he barely noticed. His eyes stayed on the girl a few paces away, as if searching for something he couldn't yet name. Clara stood motionless, her shadow drawn long over the gravel. Her sunburn was uneven, red and brown patches, telling of long days under the high plains sky. Her left hand clamped the handle of the iron pot, knuckles white, as if letting go would mean losing the last thing she owned. The slanting light picked out the uneven stitches along her hem, crooked, hurried, but holding the fabric together. He saw her boots, worn to the point where the toes looked ready to split, leather scarred with pale salt lines, The map of miles walked without rest. In the corner of the porch, the calendar still hung on the wall, turned to July. The paper was yellowed, its edges curled. September had come with dry winds and cold mornings, but here time stayed still. Jonas knew it wasn't forgetfulness. It was simply that no one made him keep track. Things here didn't change much, and he'd grown used to leaving them that way. A hand from one of the cowboys set down a coil of rope nearby, then moved quietly aside, leaving the gap between man and woman undisturbed. In that gap, Jonas felt his own hesitation keenly. He wasn't afraid of strangers. This land taught caution, not fear. What he minded was the truth that when someone stepped across this threshold, they brought their stories, their habits, their breath. And if they left, they'd take them all away, leaving a hollow behind. Just like before. He glanced down at his own hands, calloused, a long scar crossing the back of one from a young man's run-in with a taut cable. His thumb worried the frayed edge of a button, a habit when he was weighing a thing. Clara's stillness kept his attention. It wasn't defiance, nor a challenge, more the rootedness of someone who'd come too far to turn back. The sun struck a stray lock of hair across her brow, turning it to a fine gold thread. He realized he was watching for some sign, however small, that she hadn't just come here to pass through. Beneath the porch, the last sunlight slipped from the boards, leaving them in cool shadow. Jonas drew a slow breath, tasting the dry road dust under the lingering scent of coffee. Amid all that was familiar, the sight of the girl with the iron pot had become the one thing unsettled in his mind, the thing that made him weigh whether to keep his peace or open the door. He stayed where he was, still undecided, but his gaze had shifted, less guarded now, and holding, deep in its corner, a trace of something faint and unclaimed. Something that might have been hope, though he wouldn't have called it that. Part 7. The Man Who Saw Himself. Years ago, Luke Palmer stood near the barn, the brim of his straw hat shadowing half his face. He was wiping sweat and hay dust from his brow with his forearm when his eyes, almost without thinking, settled on the stranger by the fence. The distance between them wasn't far, but the layer of evening light and thick silence seemed to cut her off from the rest of the ranch. A light wind drifted through, carrying a few dry blades of grass across his line of sight. And then he remembered the day he had come here. He had stood almost the same way. Back to the fence, knees poking through worn trousers, boots tilted from worn-down heels, with nothing in his hand but a nearly empty sack. Jonas had looked at him then, the way he was looking at the girl now, measuring whether a drifter was worth. Keeping that look, half weighing, half withholding, Luke still remembered shame and hope tangled tight. He glanced at Jonas on the porch, still steady in place, eyes fixed on her. There was something in that gaze that was the same as 3 years ago, when Jonas had looked at him for the first time. Luke was not a man of many words. Out here, you learned talk didn't earn trust. Work did. But today, seeing the girl holding on to that pot as if it were life itself, he felt compelled to speak. He stepped closer, stopping halfway between Jonas and the girl. He didn't raise his voice, but pitched it just enough for the wind not to steal it. Let her try. That was all. No reasoning, no story meant to persuade. Jonas didn't need to hear much, only to see that a man once given a chance was now passing that chance along. Jonas said nothing. His shoulders stayed square, but the faint pause before he adjusted the brim of his hat was enough for Luke to know the words had landed. From her place by the fence, Clara didn't answer either. She didn't even look grateful. Her gaze shifted to Luke for a moment, then back to Jonas, as if weighing whether this stretch of land might hold a place for her, or whether it would be just another road to pass through. Evening thinned the light around them. Above, a hawk circled once and vanished toward the far range. In this country, some decisions didn't need to be spoken right away. They were warmed slowly, in the eyes, in the memory, in the hands of people used to gripping tight so nothing slipped away. And between the two of them, though neither had stepped forward, a fine thread had been tied, from a man who once was lost to the act of giving what had once saved him. Part 8. The First Fire. Jonas tilted his head, letting his gaze slip from the girl for just a heartbeat, as if a decision had been made without needing to be declared. He nodded slightly toward the iron tripod stove, standing in its familiar place beside the porch. Wind's right for a fire, that was all. No welcome, no command. Clara gave a small nod and walked toward it. Her dust-coated boots left pale gray prints across the gold of the evening light. She knelt naturally, as if she'd done this 1,000 times before, or as if this was the one time she would let herself do it without trembling. From her worn cloth sack, she laid out what she had left: a bundle of dry beans, a small yellow onion, and a twist of paper holding salt. She set them down in order, each placement careful, as if arranging pieces before an important match. The mesquite kindling caught quickly, the smoke rising with that sharp, sweet scent. She hung the black pot over the flames, poured water in, and dropped the beans in one by one, each tiny splash making a soft ticking sound. She peeled the onion slowly, the papery skin whispering in the wind, sliced it into thin petals, and let them fall into the water like withered yellow blossoms. No, one asked her what she was cooking. Out here the answer came in scents, not words. Jonas stood a few steps off, arms folded, watching her motions, not with curiosity, but with the quiet attention of a man wondering if these hands could tend a flame long enough to matter in a kitchen or in a life. She stirred slowly, the wooden spoon moving as though speaking to the simmering water. It could have been a greeting, or a memory, or a promise no one else would hear. The firelight caught in her eyes, a faint glow behind the calm. Far off, hoofbeats sounded once, then faded as though the outside world were stepping back to make room for the small circle of fire. The ranch hands, who had kept their distance at first, were now closer, not crowding, but not leaving either. The smell of beans and onion began to spread, gentle but insistent, twining into the threads of the evening breeze. It carried something this place hadn't felt in a long while. The promise of a meal meant not only to fill the stomach, but to keep people sitting together just a little longer. Clara didn't look up. She didn't invite anyone over. She simply kept stirring, as though this was the one tether she had to keep her here. And somehow, around that fire, the air felt different. Less wind, less chill, and a little less distance between the people, though not a word had been spoken. Part 9. The scent that drew them closer. The water in the pot had turned the cloudy gold of beans nearly done, each swirl of steam curling up into the sweetness of softening onion. Mesquite smoke rode the evening wind, carrying that scent beyond the fence line, slipping through the cracks of the barn doors, brushing past the slow-chewing cattle. At first, the ranch hands kept their distance, as borderland men do when faced with a stranger. But one by one, without a word between them, they stepped closer to the porch. They didn't crowd in, just found a place where they could feel the heat and catch the smell more clearly. It was a familiar scent, but tonight it carried something different, hard to name. One cowboy leaned a shoulder to the porch post, narrowing his eyes at the firelight, rough palms rubbing together as if to push off a cold that hadn't yet arrived. Another crouched on his heels, elbows on knees, eyes on the pot without speaking. No one asked the girl her name or where she'd come from. Out here, silence could be the truest form of acceptance. Jonas stayed at the porch steps, his shadow long over the ground. His gaze never left Clara, but it held no pressure, more like the steady watch a man keeps on a new unbroken horse. Not distrust, but not yet trust either. A willingness to take the time. Clara kept stirring. The hand on the wooden spoon had stopped trembling, her motions slow, and even now, the wind pushed the stray hair from her brow, showing the curve of a sun-darkened cheek. She likely didn't even notice. Her body had eased without her knowing it. The fire snapped beneath the pot, each pop marking time in the hush. There was no shouting, no gallop of hooves, only that simple sound woven through the soft hiss of wind slipping past the porch. Once Clara lifted her eyes and caught Luke Parmer watching from the yard's edge. He gave her a small nod, not the loud welcome of a man making a point, but the slow dip of the chin that said, "You're doing fine. No need to rush proving anything." The fire kept burning, and the scent of beans and onion kept spreading, threading into the open spaces of the yard, into the small gaps in the hearts of men used to living without. It was more than the smell of food. It was a quiet signal that, for tonight at least, there would be a shared meal, and maybe, just maybe, something more than a meal. Part 10. The small smile of a quiet man. By the time the pot was lifted from the fire, the shadows had climbed the porch, leaving only the pale, dust-hazed light of dusk. Clara bent to ladle the first spoonful into a chipped stoneware bowl, setting it on the table. The warmth rose with the scent of mesquite clinging faintly to her clothes. Jonas stepped forward, the heels of his boots sounding a slow, steady rhythm on the steps. He sat, not looking at Clara at once, but dipping the spoon into the bowl. He took only a small bite, chewing at a patient pace. His eyes didn't stay on the food, nor on her. They looked straight out toward the pasture where darkness was spreading inch by inch. Clara stood still, fingers gathering a bit of her apron. She wasn't hoping for praise, but she was waiting for something, a sign, however small, that the meal mattered. A thin night wind slipped across the porch, bringing with it the first trace of chill. Jonas set the spoon down. There was a pause, brief but clear, before one corner of his mouth lifted, a smile not meant for show, more for himself than for her. His voice came low, graveled but certain. "You're hired." That was it. No explanation, no questions. But Clara felt her shoulders loosen, as if some knot long pulled tight had finally eased. Her hands fell from the apron, and the pot's warmth seemed to linger around her. The other hands didn't comment, just went about taking their shares. The scrape of spoons against bowls, the slow chewing, the occasional creak of chairs filled the air. In that quiet, Clara no longer felt like an outsider lingering at the doorway. The meal passed without chatter, but this silence was nothing like the empty pauses she'd known on the road. This was not the silence of suspicion, but the kind that lets people share space without armor. When she bent to refill another bowl, Clara noticed her hand no longer shook, and somewhere deep in her chest, a small, steady light began to take hold, faint but enduring. Part 11. The Man at the Gate. The last light of day stretched long over the prairie, pooling in a deep gold band along the fence rails. The air was as still as a late afternoon pond, until hoofbeats carried in from afar, mingling with the whisper of wind through sagebrush. Jonas was gathering bowls into a tin basin on the porch when he looked up. A horse's shadow took shape in the fine dust, ridden by a broad-shouldered man who sat tall in the saddle as if the ground he crossed already belonged to him. The horse stopped right at the gate. Its rider didn't dismount, only leaned an elbow on the saddle horn and let his eyes sweep the yard like a saloon keeper taking stock. Mason Crow. The name needed no introduction to anyone around Medicine Bow. Owner of a spread twice the size of Jonas's, known not for the number of his cattle, but for the way he always managed to hire the best hands, sometimes with smooth talk, sometimes with gold coin. His gaze came to rest on Clara. She stood near the cook fire, hands still scented with smoke and beans, loose hair shadowing half her face. He tilted his head, his voice low and even, carrying across the yard. "If Hale doesn't keep you busy, my kitchen's short a cook." The yard seemed to slow. Jonas set the basin on the table, not looking at Mason right away. He took a step toward Clara, one hand braced on the back of a chair as if to hold himself steady before speaking. When he did lift his eyes, they weren't sharp but deep, like the bottom of a well holding water through a long drought. "She's got work here." The way Jonas put weight on "here" made Mason's mouth twitch in a smile that wasn't quite friendly. Out west, "here" could mean a job, or it could mean home. Mason didn't ask which. He just gathered his reins, turned the horse. Before riding off, he cast Clara one last look, half a memory, half a warning. The dust from his horse's hooves settled slowly, folding into the lingering scent of cook fire. Clara stayed where she was, eyes following until he was gone. No one spoke, but she could feel a thin line had been tied to her, secured not by contract, not by promise, but by Jonas's simple words, enough to make the evening wind warmer. Across the yard, the hands worked in silence, putting away tools. The rasp of metal, the drag of rope over dry ground, and by the fire, Clara's shadow moved on the wall, as if the place meant to keep a record of someone who'd been chosen to stay, in a land where most only pass through. Part 12. A kitchen with someone to tend it. Night came down soft as an old wool blanket over the ranch. Wind slipped through the gaps in the porch boards, laced with the fading scent of wood smoke. Clara shut the kitchen door behind her and stepped into the small room adjoining it, the place that, for now, would be her bed. Lamplight spilled warm over the dark-grained walls, showing their hairline splits and the places time had worn smooth. A narrow bed stood against the wall, a folded gray blanket on top. Beside it, a small table held a water pitcher, a couple of tin cups, and the wooden spoon she'd carried all through her wandering. She opened her bag, unpacking her few possessions: a faded apron, a paper twist of salt, a dented tin mug. Each went on the table, arranged neatly, like staking a little patch of familiar ground inside a foreign space. Outside, Jonas's footsteps moved heavy and steady toward the barn, then slowed. Through the small window she saw him by a dark bay horse, hand resting on its neck. His voice, low and slow, didn't carry words, only the kind of sound that made the horse lower its head to listen. The mix of wind and breath reminded Clara of winter nights spent in abandoned granaries without a single voice to lean on. In the kitchen, the fire had burned low, but the coals still glowed red. She knelt, using the poker to draw them together, then covered them with a light drift of ash, banking them to catch again at morning. The motion felt like a promise. Here, the fire would not die while she slept. She sat by the stove for a while, listening to the night rearrange itself, the hoot of an owl in the trees, the latch of the barn door closing, Jonas's boots crossing back toward the porch. No knock at her door, no good night. But here, silence could be as sure an acknowledgment as words. When she blew out the lamp, darkness filled the room. Yet the heat from the kitchen slipped through the thin wall fine as a thread. Lying on her side, one hand resting on the wooden spoon, Clara closed her eyes, and for the first time in months did not fear waking in the middle of the road. Part 13. Sunrise on the Wyoming flag. Morning came slow, as if the light itself wanted to test the kitchen before stepping in. The first beams slipped through the window slats, stretching into long gold stripes over the honey-colored grain of the old table. On it, a blackened iron pot of coffee sent up steam, bitter and warm, seeping into the very fibers of the room. Clara had been up since the sky outside was still turning from black to gray. She hadn't lit the fire right away. First, she'd stood by the window, watching the yard in its pale fog. Sage on the hills swayed gently in the breeze, carrying its sharp scent into the kitchen. Farther out, the Wyoming flag over the barn stirred softly, its blue field and white bison outshod in deep blue clear against the morning mist. It was a reminder of last year's statehood celebration, a moment she hadn't seen, but now somehow felt herself stepping into. She lifted the lid from the beans she'd left ready overnight. A wave of heat rose against her face, carrying the scent of onion and softened beans. She gave the pot a slow stir, then ladled a generous bowlful, placing it carefully at the seat Jonas always took, the head of the table backed against the wall, where morning light struck first. She set the spoon beside it, her motions deliberate, like preparing for an honored guest, though it was only breakfast for two. Outside, the barn door opened, then shut. Iron shoes struck the packed earth in a measured rhythm, followed by the familiar weight of footsteps heading towards the kitchen. Clara didn't turn. She poured coffee into a tin cup, letting the rising steam mingle with the warm scent of beans. When the doors swung open, light spilled in along with the cool wind. Jonas stepped through, his shadow cutting across the floor. His gaze passed over the table, the waiting bowl of beans, and lingered just for a moment on the faint curve of Clara's mouth, a smile you'd only notice if you bothered to look. Neither said good morning, but the air in the kitchen felt fuller, as if they had both silently agreed to keep this quiet intact. Out here, silence could be a stronger bond than any greeting. Part 14. The Promise Unspoken. Jonas pulled out his chair, the scrape of its legs soft against the floorboards, and sat. His shape fell into the slant of light from the window, solid, still. Clara sat too, her fingers resting lightly on the worn wooden spoon. They began to eat without hurry, as though each spoonful was a shared breath. Outside, the early wind moved through the sage, carrying the season's faint edge of cold. The Wyoming flag by the barn rustled, its cloth whispering against the sound of spoons tapping bowls. In the dirt beyond the gate, Mason's hoofprints from yesterday were already fading under wind and dew, faint marks that would vanish before noon. Jonas finished and set his spoon down, leaning back in his chair. His eyes found the spoon in Clara's hand, then slid to the fire, still glowing red in the hearth. No question was asked, no answer given. But somewhere in that glance, Clara read the quiet truth. She would not be sent away with the next sunrise. She rose, added fresh-cut pine to the flames. The logs caught with a soft crackle, sending the resin's sharp, clean scent into the room. Jonas watched her, the faintest curve at his mouth. Not quite a smile, but enough for the morning light to catch. They returned to the table, each sipping from their coffee. Outside, the sun's first touch reached the fence, turning the thinning mist into golden ribbons. Breakfast ended without a spoken pledge, but in the West, some bonds lasted longer for never being put into words, like a fire tended through the night, or tracks pressed side by side in the dirt after the wind has passed. In that space, the fragile trust between them was no longer fragile, and in a place where most people drifted on, sometimes a breakfast shared in silence was reason enough for two guarded souls to stay. The evening breeze skimmed along the porch, carrying the mingled scents of beans, coffee, and freshly cut pine. On the table, the two bowls sat nearly empty, yet the warmth still lingered in the kitchen like a promise left unspoken. Outside, the hoofprints had been erased, leaving only the slant of sunlight spilling across the pasture. In a land where most people move on, sometimes all it takes is a fire kept burning long enough to make even the most guarded hearts choose to stay. If this story reminds you of a moment when someone stayed by your side just when you thought you were alone, share a few words in the comments below. Who knows, your words might be the fire for someone else.